Well, unhinged conspiracy theories continue to spread about the internet. Here in the real world, we still get a bit of shock and kind of dark humor in the sense. Accidental shots fired at downtown Lafayette protests. Now, nobody was hurt. That was important. That's why I say dark humor. But it is still kind of worrying that we're reaching this level of just pure insanity. The NFAC, the Not Effing Around Coalition. They've been calling for like a black ethno-state or something to that effect. And they've been marching around armed and for the second time have accidentally discharged their weapons. Great. But this isn't the big story. It's just something that I wanted to highlight because it shows you the danger of a bunch of untrained political zealots walking around. And listen, I'm not going to tell them they can't do it. Yes, you got a Second Amendment right. You go do what you're allowed to do. That's fine. But right now we have this poll, and this is coming out of Politico, that says Americans increasingly believe violence is justified if the other side wins. Our research detected an uptick in recent months in the share of Americans willing to condone political unrest. So while I want to highlight this one story, it's very simple. No one was hit, no injuries reported. 26-year-old Terrence Jones of Lafayette has been charged with reckless discharge of a firearm at a parade or demonstration. 3 counts possession of a firearm. 1 count simple escape, illegal use of weapons, blah, blah, blah. Take a person like this and the NFAC. Drop them in major civil unrest where they believe their use of force and violence is justified. And then wait and see what happens. And it's not going to be fun. Not at all. It's partly why I left the big cities and now I'm kind of out in the middle of nowhere. Mountains before me. I was actually talking to a local who I would have assumed would have been more left-leaning. But, you know, the people out here are not happy with the riots. And they, I was talking to one dude. He said, we all are sitting here watching what's going on in these cities with the violence and the chaos. And then we just laugh like that's why we don't want to be there. You're out in the middle of nowhere. You're safer. And these people out here, they don't want conflict. It reminds me of this natural component of evolution where we find the lower the number of dimensions an animal moves in, then the more violent they become. For instance, if you take a badger, which burrows into a hole and then it's trapped in that hole, these things are vicious. Now, they're crazy, right? Because they had to. They evolved this way. You can't run away. So the creatures that burrow and then don't fight die. What about birds? Birds tend not to fight because birds can just leave. When fleeing is an option, the more life tends to take the option because it's less energy intensive, less risky. Out in the middle of nowhere, you got more options for fleeing than you do in the city. So less risky. People prefer to be out here. And in the long run, I think the people who live out here are more likely to get by just fine and stay safe. Here's a story from Politico. They say, like a growing number of prominent American leaders and scholars, we are increasingly anxious that this country is headed toward the worst post-election crisis in a century and a half. Our biggest concern is that a disputed presidential election, especially if there are close contests in a few swing states, or if one candidate denounces the legitimacy of the process, could generate violence and bloodshed. Unfortunately, we're not being alarmist about the potential for violence. Trends in public opinion that we've been tracking provide strong grounds for concern. Our research, which we're reporting here for the first time, shows an upswing in the past few months in the number of Americans, both Democrats and Republicans, who said they think violence would be justified if their side loses the upcoming presidential election. Seriously, if they lose, both sides feel it. The growing acceptance of this possibility of violence is a bipartisan movement. Our data shows the willingness of Democrats and Republicans alike to justify violence as a way to achieve political goals has essentially been rising in lockstep. All of us have been involved, separately and eventually together, in surveying and researching Americans' political attitudes and engagement. Late last year, we noticed an uptick in the number of respondents saying they would condone violence by their own political party. And we decided to combine our data sets to get as much information as possible on this worrisome trend. We were also monitoring another question. Would you condone violence if the other party's candidate wins the presidential election? While the pool of respondents between our data sets is slightly different, our questions have had the same wording. Here's what we found. A growing openness to political violence. On November 2017, only 8%. On October 18, 13% of Democrats, 11% of Republicans. Democrats have consistently endorsed violence over Republicans until 2020. On June 1st, 2020, 30% of both Democrat and Republican supported violence. And now, as of September, Republicans at 36, Democrats at 33, and I'll tell you why. It's actually really simple. Antifa. Antifa has continually engaged in violence, and Republicans have done nothing. Now the right is straight up saying, you know what? We must strike back. If the violence erupts, we'll see how things play out. Among Americans who identify as Democrat or Republican, 1 in 3 now believe that violence could be justified, to advance their party's political goals, a substantial increase of the last years. In September, 44% of Republicans and 41% of Democrats said there would be at least a little justification for violence if the other party's nominee wins the election. Those figures are both up from June, when 35% of Republicans and 37% of Democrats expressed the same sentiment. Similarly, 36% of Republicans and 33% of Democrats said it's at least a little justified for their side to use violence in advancing political goals, up from 30% of both Republicans and Democrats in June. There has been an even larger increase in the share of both Democrats and Republicans who believe there would be either a lot or a great deal of justification for violence if their party were to lose in November. The share of Republicans seeing substantial justification for violence if their side loses jumped from 15% in June to 20% in September, while the share of Democrats jumped from 16 to 19. These numbers are even higher among the most ideological partisans. Of Democrats who identify as very liberal, 26% said there would be a great deal of justification for violence if their candidate loses the presidency, compared to 7% of those identifying as simply liberal. Of Republicans who identify as very conservative, 16% said they believe there would be a great deal. And they go on to mention that only 7% of those who identify as conservative. This means the ideological extremes of each party are 2 to 4 times more apt to see violence as justified than their party's mainstream members. Yet who takes the lead? Why, by 10 points, it's the far left. There is almost, which I don't want to say double, but maybe like 70 to 80% more among the far left who are willing to justify violence than very conservatives. What does that mean? It's what I've been saying. The far left is off the rails. And this could lead to very serious violence where if the far left continues the rioting and the destruction and kicks it up a notch to murdering like they already have in Portland, what do you think the right is going to do? Is the right going to sit back and allow it? Probably not. But the worrying thing I can say for the right is that you don't own communications. The left does. Communications infrastructure is owned by the left. Now, some people have pointed out to me, Tim, you don't realize there are militia groups that have been training for this kind of stuff, and they have communications, and they could use ham radio anyway. In which case, yeah. How seriously should we take these expressions of violence? Both history and social psychology warn us to take them very seriously. In Europe in the 1920s and 1930s, a rising tide of armed street mobilization and of violent clashes between rival partisans ravaged fragile democratic cultures, bullied and marginalized moderate forces, and gave rising autocrats an excuse to seize emergency powers. Some of us who've studied the rise of authoritarians see strong parallels between that period of European history and factors at work in America today. And so I have said now for nearly 3 years, Antifa will give rise to the far right. Yep. You see, as the chaos unfolds across these cities, I believe it's very likely that many regular people are now going to vote for Trump. Of course, the polling says Trump is going to lose. Okay, we'll see. Seriously, maybe he'll lose. I can't imagine this. You know, you've got Antifa running around burning things down and destroying lives. People are going to beg for law and order, and they're going to get it. Donald Trump will give it to them. We've already seen the feds deputize police in Oregon. That's an expansion of federal authority. The locals are freaking out, but the locals haven't done anything to stop the violence. In which case, I can only assume we are much more likely to see Donald Trump win. Donald Trump invoke some kind of powers, maybe not necessarily the Insurrection Act, shut down the rioting. Donald Trump might win. There'll be a disputed election. The violence will get extremely bad. 52% of people are prepping because of COVID and because of unrest. Are you? Now, I've warned about all of this stuff for years. And there are a lot of people who make fun of me for it, but I'll tell you what, man. I got these food bin things that I pitched before to people. And a lot of people laughed and said, Tim's selling emergency food. Yeah, I am. Yeah, absolutely. You know why? Because I've already cracked open a bin and it's like Hamburger Helper. You know, it's like you got mac and cheese, you pour it in a thing of water, you stir it, boom, mac and cheese. That easy. It's like any regular food you'd buy from the store, but it's sealed in pouches that keep it fresh. So while all of you are laughing and dancing around like the silly grasshopper, us little ants will be packing away for the winter. And then should winter come, don't come and knocking on my door because y'all ain't going to get anything from me. You can take care of yourself, and I hope you're paying attention. More and more stories are coming out and telling us this. I'll leave it there. Next segment's coming up tomorrow at 10 a.m. Thanks for hanging out, and I'll see you all next time.